What is up, boys? Welcome back to the channel. We all know the GM LS is a really popular engine for engine swaps. You'll find it in everything from Jeeps, Miatas, trains, boats, planes, helicopters, you name it, it's been LS swapped. Some of the more popular LS engines include the LS1, LS2, LS3, LS7, LS9, LSA, LQ, LM truck motors, and so on. Now today we're specifically going to look at the LS2 and the LS3, and we're going to compare them to find out which one is better. Let's go. Now pretty much throughout the entire LS engine family, all the engines are actually pretty similar. The Gen 3 and Gen 4, the main difference that you'll find across all Gen 3 and Gen 4 engines is the fact that the Gen 4 generally has a slightly stronger block, but even then, it's very, very minor. The main difference that you'll find between all LS engines are going to be the intake manifold, cylinder heads, and the camshaft. To cover some basic info, the LS2 is a Gen 4 6-liter aluminum small block engine, and the LS3 is also a Gen 4, but it's a 6.2-liter aluminum small block engine. In terms of design, they are very, very similar since they're both Gen 4 engines. Now, the most obvious difference that you'll find between these two engines is the increased displacement, but there are a lot more changes underneath the surface. Right off the bat, one of the first things I want to talk about with these two engines are the cylinder heads. This is an area where GM really knocked it out of the park with pretty much all LS, LQ, LM engines. If you've watched this channel before, you know that cylinder heads are generally where you're going to make the most horsepower. So if you have a good cylinder head, you're going to be able to produce a lot of power regardless of what the engine is. Now this is true for pretty much all LS engines all the way down to the LQ and LM truck series. Obviously the simplest difference that you'll find between the LS2 and the LS3 cylinder heads are going to be the casting numbers, but we're here for a lot more than just that. The LS3 cylinder heads, which are identical to those found on the L76 and L92, use 2.165-inch intake valves and 1.59-inch exhaust valves. This is a notable increase compared to the LS2's 243 heads, which have 2-inch intake valves and 1.55-inch exhaust valves. Now, something I think is worth noting is that the LS2 heads are same as the LS6 heads found on the Z06, minus the sodium-filled exhaust valves. Both the LS2 and LS3 cylinder heads use D-shaped exhaust ports, but on the intake side, things get a lot different because the LS2 uses cathedral-style ports, where the LS3 uses rectangular-style ports. There is an argument for both, and a lot of people will say cathedral ports are better for airflow, and a lot of people will say rectangular ports are better for airflow. But in this case, the LS3 does provide more airflow because it has larger intake ports and larger exhaust ports. To put this really simply, the LS3 heads are better than the LS2 heads, but that doesn't mean that the LS2 heads are bad, it just means that the LS3 heads are better. And it is worth noting the LS3 heads are some of the best OEM LS heads that you can buy. GM also improved how they manufactured the LS2 heads, so they are cheaper to manufacture and sell compared to LS2 and LS6 heads, which makes them even more desirable because the price point is actually pretty low for what you're getting. From browsing around some forums and asking some engine builders, it seems like bolting LS3 heads onto an LS2 and changing pretty much nothing else will give you about 20 wheel horsepower. Now, 20 wheel horsepower gain is pretty impressive considering you're swapping OEM parts for more OEM parts, which again just shows that the LS3 heads are the better heads. The next thing I want to look at are the differences between the camshafts, because this is another big factor to making power with a GM LS engine. Now, without getting into too much detail, the LS3 heads are better than the LS2 heads, and I'll throw some specs on the screen for you to see here. And to put it really simply, basically the LS2, LS3, they have a very similar amount of duration, but the LS3 has more valve lift and a slightly wider lobe separation angle. The wider lobe separation angle should help the LS3 camshaft produce a wider power band, but it's only a 1 degree difference, so you're really not going to see this on a dyno sheet. The important difference here is that the LS3 cam has more intake valve lift, which is just going to improve airflow and help it make more power. With the head and camshaft specs laid out, you can start to see how the LS3 is going to make more power than an LS2. If you were to look at the power specs on paper, the LS3 obviously makes more power and more torque than an LS2, but this gets more interesting when you break it down by power per liter, because you have to remember the LS2 has more displacement, and we need to account for that to see that the LS3 can actually produce more power. When you break this down with some math and you can see power per liter, the LS3 does make more power per liter. This is mostly just from the heads and the camshaft, but it's also from the intake manifold and some other minor changes, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Now, the next thing we need to cover on the top end of these engines is the intake manifold. And again, this is an area where you'll see a big difference between LS engines, and a good intake manifold can really make the difference between making a lot of power and making very little power out of your LS engine. To cut straight to the point, the LS3 does have a better intake manifold that has slightly larger and straighter runners for optimized flow. Looking at the bottom end and the rotating assembly of these engines, they are very, very similar. They both have 6-bolt main caps, flat top hyper-eutectic cast aluminum pistons, powdered metal connecting rods, and a cast iron crankshaft. It is worth noting that the LS3 in the Corvette Grand Sport actually has a forged crankshaft rather than a cast iron crankshaft, but all other LS3 applications have a cast iron crank. These two engines also share the same bore spacing and deck height. I know we already mentioned the difference in displacement, but it's worth looking at a little bit closer before we move on. Now again, the LS2 is a 6-liter engine and the LS3 is a 6.2-liter engine. Now, GM increased displacement by keeping stroke exactly the same, but they increased bore from 101.6 millimeters up to 103.25 millimeters. With that increase in bore came an increase in displacement of about 200 cc's. Now, when you think about picking up a cheap used LS engine, a lot of people are going to think about picking up an LS1 from a Camaro or something like an LM7 from a Tahoe. Now, the reason that they would consider that kind of LS engine rather than an LS2 or an LS3 is because of pricing. You have to remember that the LS2 and the LS3 aren't going to be as abundant because they weren't used in as many applications as something like an LQ, an LM, or an LS1. That being said, there is a cheaper option between LS2 and LS3. The LS2 was released in 2005, and it was the all-new Corvette base engine, and it was also the optional engine from the 05-06 GTO. Because of its smaller production and the fact that it's newer, the LS2 is typically more expensive than an LS1, but it isn't really worth the premium to most enthusiasts. The LS3 was released in 2008, and much like the LS2 before it, it was the all-new Corvette base engine. The LS3 was also used in the 2010 to 2015 Camaro. This means that the LS3 is theoretically more abundant than the LS2, but because of how new the engine is and the fact that it offers a little bit more power overall, they're pretty expensive, and you're generally going to be able to find an LS2 for a little bit less money than an LS3. Now, to wrap this all up, this debate is much like the LS1 versus LS2 debate, where there's not really actually that much to debate. The later engine is the better engine. In this case, the LS3 is the better engine. It has a better intake manifold, better cylinder heads, a better camshaft, more displacement, and it has more power potential overall. The only area where the LS2 is slightly better than the LS3 is going to be pricing. Now, if you were really concerned about pricing, you wouldn't even consider either of these engines, and you'd probably end up with an LQ or an LM engine, but that's a topic for a different time. So yeah, I think the LS3 is the better engine, but if you are on a super strict budget, sure, the LS2 is a better engine. But I want to know what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments below which one you think is better, or which LS engine you'd rather have over an LS2 or an LS3. While you're down there, smash the thumbs up button, it really helps me out. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos. Check out some of the other videos we have on the channel. We covered a ton of different engines, and I'll see you guys in the next one.